The next step in the process is to address shading the lighter end of the spectrum. I'm going to begin with this area because it's surrounded by shadow. I'm just hatching the value in, going right over the previous shading I did with the B-lead. The lead from the H pencil won't affect it. The challenge here is going to be to gradiate the texture from the B-lead into the texture the H-lead is creating. Just remember what you practiced in the shading lessons in the beginning of the course and gradually build it up. I'm going to lighten this spot a little with my sharpened eraser. It's a tricky area. Do you see what's happening with the light here? The two light sources are converging. This shape is from the main light source coming in from the right, and this shape is light from the secondary light source that was on the other side. In this case, it's reflected light from the fill. And this is the spot where they intersect. Do you see it now? Okay, back to the drawing. I've switched to a B-lead to darken the shading around her nose. I'm just taking a second to erase any of my shading that's gone outside the line. At this point, it's safe to erase the access lines as well. You should also erase any lines you can still see on her face, since we're going to be shading in that area next. I've chosen to go with an H-lead to shade in the value on her forehead. You can use a B-lead if you have good pressure control. I chose the H because I think it'll best demonstrate building up the value. Remember to dab the outlines you drew around the highlights with a rubber eraser as you get to them. I'm going to shade right over this highlight. I'll come back later and erase the spot to extract it. I'm shading right over the highlights on her nose as well. I'll come back later and erase them out with my sharpened eraser. Okay, now that I have the value in for the light side of her forehead, the shadow side looks too light. The B-lead just wasn't dark enough, so I'm going to have to go up to a 2B and bring it up about 2 values. Sometimes that's unavoidable. And as you can see, as I put the shading in, I'm adjusting the softness and shape of the edge of the shadow. I'm going to bring the area of her hair around the shadow up a few values as well, because her hair is going to get a lot darker before we're done, which is going to make the shadow seem relatively lighter. Bringing all the values up in unison can be a bit of a balancing act. That's getting better. I'll switch to an H-LED and give the midtone on her forehead another pass. I'll go over some of the texture in the shadow as well, just to make it look less grainy. I'm switching back to a B-LED for this area. Notice it's lighter than the shadow on her forehead, but still needs to get a value darker than it is now. It gets a bit lighter under the left side of her lip. See that? I think the shape of her lip can be adjusted a little. It's not ideal to have to do any erasing at this stage, but sometimes it's unavoidable. And it's still good for you to see how to handle making a fix like this one. If your drawing doesn't need this adjustment, just follow along. Begin by adjusting the shape of her lip with a rubber eraser. Then simply shade lightly over the erased area with your B-LED until it looks seamless. Easy enough. Okay, moving on. I'll continue shading the shadow on this side of her face. Remember to run the shadow right over her neck as well. I've focused on her face a little too much already, and it's starting to look disconnected. When that happens, you could find yourself having trouble trying to match either the values or textures. That's why it's best not to treat the shadow as separate parts. Treat it all as one entity. Remember to mind that line of rim light. It's important because it makes her chin look rounded instead of flat. And I think the gradient on her nose can use some work transitioning from the shadow to the midtone. It needs to look more rounded. I'm jumping around my drawing a little at this point to fix the areas I think need to be adjusted as they become evident to me. Surely your drawing needs different adjustments, so after watching this section, pause your video, step back a few feet from your work, and look for the areas that need attention on your drawing. I'm carefully adjusting the shape of her nostrils. The edges are soft, so I'm gently making tiny circles to gradiate them out. Remember, the pupil should be the darkest spot on your drawing. As the artist, your job is to control where the viewer's eyes are drawn first, and after that, where they move around your work. And all that happens in the first split second that a person sees a piece. A person decides whether or not they like a piece of art in under a second. If you want to learn more about the power of subconscious decisions, read the book Blank by Malcolm Gladwell. It's a New York Times bestseller and well worth the read. The book explains that in a fraction of a second, your unconscious mind has performed millions of calculations and drawn a conclusion before your conscious thoughts have even had time to start to come up with the words needed to describe the scenario. It explains that if you learn to trust your subconscious mind's calculations, they beat all of your reasoning every time. I think this book should be mandatory reading in every art college. The reason this concept is so relevant to drawing is because if the symmetry is off even a tiny amount, our eye will notice it. Maybe not consciously, but in the blink of an eye it will register and the viewer will decide whether or not they like a piece of art. They can't explain why, it just feels off. Of course, there's only so much about that we can control. For example, having a subject's nostrils be a dominant feature instead of their eyes is something you can actively, easily manage, and that'll give your drawing a better chance. Great art is made up of dozens of these little idiosyncrasies and rules. You aren't expected to know them all. It's something you just slowly pick up over time. That's what makes making art so interesting. You can always learn more. I'm just using an H-LED to shade in the mid-tone value on the light side of her face. Careful not to lose this little highlight in the corner of her mouth. Before shading in the light side of her face, remember to reduce the visibility of your preliminary sketch lines with a rubber eraser. And remember, when using an H-LED for shading, not to hold it too close to the tip. You should be holding it way back here to get a nice, flowing hatching line.